everybody. This is Jackie Luqman.
I'm up to Shahid Luqman.
And this is a special edition of Coffee, Current Events, and Politics in Luqman Nation, because today we are talking to a good friend of Luqman Nation and the Luqmans, and a lifelong warrior for social justice, and especially in the anti-war movement. And that's our friend Phil Wilayto, co-founder of the Virginia Defenders, all the way from Richmond, Virginia. How you doing, Phil?
I'm doing very well, Jacqueline. Yourself? Hi, Ave.
Hey, well,
Let me
Phil.
close that. There we go. So, while we are giving people a chance to hop on the stream, we're making sure we've got all of our technical issues straight. Looks like we might be having a little bit of bandwidth issues as usual. But we're just going to give people a few minutes to join the broadcast, because we really want to take a pretty good dive, as much as we can, into this issue of the Iran protests and possible regime change in the area, in that region, and just to talk about American imperialism on the whole, because it's something that progressives don't focus as much on, because of this so-called honeymoon period of 8 years of Obama, right? Where we focus so much, like you had said earlier in our meeting with the Virginia Defenders, that people were so focused on domestic issues that they didn't really pay attention to what our government was doing around the world. And because we've said before, Americans in general have a really narrow, limited view of imperialism from America and what we do in other countries. So we wanted to talk about that a little bit today. So, Phil, what is going on in Iran? For people who see it on the news, don't understand it, explain what's going on in Iran.
Well, I guess you mean explain what's going on behind what's going on in Iran.
Right.
Because it's been well publicized that there's been, what are we, up to 9 days now, 10 days of protests in cities around the country that began as protests against some economic developments, rising prices and some important commodities, and morphed into a more general criticism of the government. And a lot of people in this country are assuming it's very similar to the protests that took place in 2009 after the re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the so-called Green Movement. And in recent days, there's been several large counter-protests in support of the government, or specifically against violence that has been taking place in some of the anti-government protests. The burning of government buildings, banks, attacks on police stations, attacks on a synagogue, attacks on police officers. At this point, the government says that 21 people have been killed in some connection with the protest, and I believe that includes at least one police officer. And the Iranian government, as of today, says there are about 450 people who have been arrested. The United States government is saying it's more like 1,000 or 1,100. They get their information from, but it's suffice to say there's been a wave of criticism, a wave of protest. So what does this mean? Why is it happening? What's the significance of it? Is it similar to 2009? Does it mean that the Iranian people are rising up to overthrow their government, which of course is what President Donald Trump would like, and has been egging on the protests, many tweeting episodes.
Yeah.
The protests have also won support from President Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel.
Of course it would.
And while the first natural reaction of progressives anywhere when they see particularly working class people out on the streets demanding economic justice is to instinctively support the protests. But when we look to the left and we see Donald Trump cheering on the protests, and we look to our right and we see Netanyahu cheering on the protests, it ought to at least give us pause that there's been no such turnout of support for the people of Honduras
Right.
coming out in the streets against the crooked re-election of the president there. So it's an immediate tip-off that the situation is at least complicated. What seems to have triggered things was there was a which one report I read was due to culling of chicken flocks as a result of outbreak of avian flu. So that's one possibility. One explanation of why the price of these basic food items went up so high. The price of gasoline is being raised by 50%. And of course, gasoline is very heavily subsidized in Iran. Iran does not have a great refinery capacity and is not able to build one because of the economic sanctions. So they must sell their raw petroleum to other countries, which then refine them and sell them back to Iran. And they have to buy this refined gasoline, and they keep it quite reasonable by heavy subsidies. So there's been some criticism that this contributes to the heavy pollution issues in major cities like Tehran. And supposedly the money raised from this rise in the price of gasoline, which is owned by the government, it's one of the areas of the economy that is state-owned, and the profits would be used to address unemployment in the country, which is officially about 23% among the youth, and unofficially more like 40% in a country where half the population is under 30. Now, why? And there are other things that have happened recently that affect the standard of living of the average person in Iran, and also the general feeling that although some sanctions have been lifted against the country as a result of the U.S. G5 Iran nuclear deal, and Iran is able to sell its oil a little easier, the economic benefits from that treaty, that agreement, it's not a treaty actually, have not filtered down to the average person in Iran. So at the same time, Iran is not a socialist country. It has a very interesting constitution that mandates that there are actually three forms of economic model to be pursued. One is state ownership of major areas of the economy. One is private ownership of businesses and corporations. And one is a sort of cooperative model. And the three are supposed to exist in harmony. And there's always tension between neoliberals in the government who want to see more privatization, deregulation, cutbacks in social services. And those are called the moderates by the Western press. And those who want to maintain state ownership of much of the economy, which funds subsidies and benefits for the poor, in particular pre-healthcare and education up through the university level. And those are the ones that are called the hardliners in the U.S. So I found an interesting report from the International Monetary Fund that came out December 17th. And the IMF had just sent a team of experts to Iran to discuss with the government how they were implementing recommendations from the IMF. And the recommendations included things like pension reform. Now, that didn't mean raising pensions. as you can guess. Reforming labor law. In Iran, it's very difficult to fire a worker. Workers have very set rights that are laid out in labor law. I'm not familiar enough to the situation to know how well they're enforced, but they're enforced well enough, I guess, that the IMF is concerned about them. For example, if you're arrested for a crime in Iran and you are acquitted, you are guaranteed to have your job back.
Wow, what a novel idea.
And if you are accused of some crime by your employer, the employer has to provide a percentage of your salary to your family while you are in prison. And if you are acquitted, you get your job back, whatever pay you have not been paid, and you can bring charges against the boss.
Wow.
This is written into the labor law, that there has to be facilities for breastfeeding in any enterprise that is larger than a certain number of workers. I forget what the figure is, if it's 20 or 25 or 50, but the right to breastfeed on the job is something that is written into labor law. So these kind of things make it less attractive to corporations to invest in Iran, and the IMF's role is to dangle loans in front of the government and to, in return for loans, to demand increased privatization, increased deregulation of industry, and fewer social benefits for the working class. And that's the kind of structural adjustment reform they demanded from countries all over the world. And they do that in Iran. And the former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was very opposed to those type of quote unquote reforms. He comes from a working class background himself, the son of a blacksmith, lived very simply in an apartment that he rented. He very much paid attention to the needs of working class people in the cities and in the rural areas. I'm not to say that his administration empowered the working class, but it was a sympathetic administration. President Rouhani has been less so. He is more of a neoliberal, in line with the goals of the IMF, and the result of his agreement to IMF demands has been behind a lot of the economic problems that the working class faces. Plus the fact that there is a great wealth inequality in Iran, not as much as there is in the United States, but there are very wealthy people.
Wow.
President Rouhani's major financial backer during his first election campaign was the Ayatollah Rafsanjani, who, among other things, he passed last year. Among other things he owned was 300 private universities. There's not enough slots in all of the state-owned universities, so that people, if they can't get into a state-owned university, they will pay to go to a private university. He owned 300. Forbes magazine listed him as one of the richest people in the world. He's a multi-billionaire. And a fan of Milton Friedman of the Chicago School of Economics. So again, a neoliberal approach. So when the immediate cause of the protests in the city of Mashhad, which is in the northeast part of the country, the second largest city in Iran, and also a holy center, revered by the followers of the Shia branch of Islam. And that's where the protests reportedly started. And the thing that may have triggered it was several banks in the area went bankrupt and people were unable to get their deposits back immediately. And the banks were privately owned banks that were not certified by the government and had been competing with each other, offering high rates of return on deposits, and that led to them going bankrupt. And so there was this immediate economic crisis with people unable to get the money they had had deposited in the banks their savings, and so went out into the streets. I read one account in the New York Times that said that another issue was they knew national federal budget, which included a number of things that were detrimental to working class people, and that report may have been leaked a little early by some of Rouhani's political opponents in the government, and that also contributed to anger in the streets. So on that level, so far, we seem to be talking about a more working class protest than the Green Movement, which was primarily centered in northern Tehran, which is sort of the Upper East Side, Upper West Side of Manhattan type part of Tehran, as opposed to southern Tehran, which is much more working class, which was Ahmadinejad's base when he was mayor of Tehran. And that Green Movement was largely of college-educated youth backed up by businesses who were opposed to Ahmadinejad's approach to the economy, which was more pro-working class. And this time around, the protests are not centered in Tehran. There have been big demonstrations there, including on the campus of the University of Tehran. But by and large, the protests have been more spread around the country, including in rural areas that were a part of Ahmadinejad's base. So they seem to have a more working class character. But some of the demands that have been raised and the morphing over into violent actions, there's a real question, at least in my mind, was this a natural progression of the protests, which just increased in anger and advanced from economic demands, which would be reform demands, to anti-government demands and even calling for regime change? Was that a natural progression, or has another element got involved in these protests and tried to take it in that direction? And of course, that direction is what people like Trump and Netanyahu are the most enthusiastic about. Some of the chants that have been reported in the Western press, at least, are criticizing the government's support of the Palestinian struggle, particularly aid sent to Gaza and Lebanon. Mm-hmm. That's not a progressive demand. Praise for the deposed Shah, who was a real brutal dictator. That's not a progressive demand. Right. Now, are those isolated instances that are being played up by the Western press, or is that more of a mass demand? I don't know. And a lot of analysts on all across the political spectrum are scratching their heads at this point. There's a layer of the section of the U.S. progressive movement that is supporting the protests uncritically, coming out of the same sort of political background as those who supported protests in the socialist countries uncritically. And we know where that eventually led to. And it wasn't freedom.
Wow.
Hey, Phil, if I may jump in here. First of all, I wanted to say to our audience that if you have any questions for Mr. Phil Wilayto, please put it in our chat, and we would gladly ask him the questions that is on your mind. But what I wanted to say, and that's just so interesting, what you have presented to us so far. My question, Phil, is why should we care? I mean, people that's watching this live stream right now, what does that have to do with us? What does any of this have to do with us?
Well, years ago, there was a conflict in a faraway country called Vietnam. And if you had tried to go out in the streets and talk to folks about it, they would have asked the same question. Why should I care about Vietnam? Vietnam fundamentally changed this country. It had a devastating effect on the black community. A whole generation of black males was affected by dying in Vietnam, being wounded in Vietnam, becoming addicted to drugs from Vietnam. More U.S. citizens who were veterans of the Vietnam War have committed suicide and were killed in the Vietnam War, which was more than 58,000 people. Wow. It devastated Black communities, removing the male from the households. That wasn't the result of psychedelic music or rap music or permissive culture. That was the result of the war on drugs, which followed the Vietnam War, along with deindustrialization of the country and the introduction of drugs by the government, which has been documented. Right. Wars can have an incredible effect. If we were to go to war with Iran, it would not be like a war against Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan. Iran is a country of 80 million people, the vast majority of whom would rally in defense of the government in the event of any attack. I don't think there's any real question about that, except from propagandists from the right wing or the U.S. government. On the other hand, there are divisions within Iran. There's probably a third of the country that is more middle class and less religiously oriented, perhaps enamored in some ways of Western lifestyles. And there's perhaps 2/3 of the country that is more traditional in social mores, but also more working class. And I base those figures on how the vote came down in President Ahmadinejad's re-election campaign, and it's studies that have been done by groups like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is not a progressive organization by any means, but who basically predicted how the vote in 2009 would go. There are divisions, there are class divisions, there are some ethnic divisions in the country. Why we should be concerned, one is the simple question of justice. If the United States is intervening in other countries to the detriment of people who are much more like us than we are like our own rulers, that should concern us. If there's a question of an actual war, that should concern us. The amount of money that is spent in military adventures around the world, the preparation for war, the cost of the present war, paying for the debts of previous wars, consumes some 50% of our U.S. federal tax dollars. They tell us that the defense budget is 25%, but that doesn't include the cost of the wars. It doesn't include the Veterans Administration. It doesn't include nuclear weapons, which come under the Department of Energy. It doesn't include the interest on the national debt, which is largely the result of paying for wars on credit cards. So if there's not enough money for your school, if there's not enough money for job training, there's not enough money for public works training, if there's not enough money to protect the environment, that's largely due to the fact that so much of our wealth as a country is poured into maintaining a military force to protect an economic empire around the world, and that should concern us.
But yet, Phil, that's the problem. We don't have, you bring up the Vietnam War, and we had a robust anti-war movement during that time, and all of this stuff should alarm us. But yet, when you look out, when you talk to the average American, when you look at what's going on out there in the streets, there don't seem to be a lot of concern about what our country is doing as far as what you explained to us, and how they're trying, and the interventionist attitudes that they're having in these countries. I mean, it's different. You bring up the Vietnam War, but we had an anti-war movement, and now, I mean, what has changed?
Well, a lot of things have changed. One is, as Jacqueline mentioned, we had 4 years of the presidency of the first Black president of the country. And he never went a single day without being attacked in vicious, racist ways by the right wing. And there was a natural inclination of both white progressives and the black community to rally around him and defend him. And he was more progressive on many issues, at least in his rhetoric, than many previous presidents. At the same time, he was given a pass on his international issues. And I think the ruling class is smart enough to know that that would happen. They had a George Bush who was unpopular, who had his policies isolated the United States around the world. And they brought in a new face with a new approach who could put over policies that may not have been accepted by a white male. For example, destroying the most prosperous country on the continent of Africa, Libya.
That's right.
Bombing it into failed state, leading to the actual lynching of its president. And when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was told that Muammar Gaddafi had been killed, she laughed. And then she said, "We came, we saw, he died." And she laughed again. And that was filmed. It was an interview with a reporter. Now, that person was the Democratic candidate for president in 2016, a neoliberal who never met a worker she cared about, who personified the arrogant, affluent class that has no sympathy for working class people, who promoted free trade policies, so-called, that have cost hundreds of thousands of jobs, and was a warmonger on almost every issue around the world. That's who they put up for a candidate. And a combination of racism and legitimate working class demands that were exploited by Trump was what led to the results in the election. Who knows what Russia was actually involved in? But the reason why the Democrats lost is they put up a lousy candidate, and that worry about that happening again. So the Obama years was one factor. Another factor is Vietnam was a war that seemed to have a beginning and an escalation and a consciousness around it, and it ended. The wars that we're involved in today have no real beginning, middle, or end. Yes, we send troops to a country. We don't send them, the government sends them. And sometimes they declare victory, as they recently have against ISIS in Iraq. But it's more like there is a constant background of endless wars that people are just used to. The youth are usually in the forefront of the anti-war movements. A 24-year-old person today would have been 15 years old when Barack Obama was elected. They grew up in an atmosphere of both not criticizing the president on international issues and an idea that wars have become more or less like the weather. You might be concerned about it, but what can you actually do about it? I mean, for one example, one of the largest peace coalitions in the country was United for Peace and Justice. As Obama began to get some traction as a peace candidate, remember he was a peace candidate before he was a black.
That's true.
It was the vote in Iowa by white people that projected him into the image of a winner. That and money from the Goldman Sachs financial institution is what fueled his candidacy. And in United for Peace and Justice, a lot of their supporters began to funnel their money into the Obama presidential campaign. And so much so that they ran out of money to pay their staff, and their 5 staff members all resigned. So they transformed themselves from a coalition into a network and just kept a website up. Now, that was an organization that at one point could pull 100,000 people out into the streets, and they basically dissolved. So the endless wars, the shrinking of the anti-war movement, which depended in large part on liberal money that went in to support the Democrats, and the Obama candidacy. As far as where working class people are concerned, here in Richmond, there are 10,000 people living in public housing. In 50 of those units, there is no heat today.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
they've been without heat for several weeks. And the reason is the Richmond Redevelopment and Housing Authority has not been doing preventative maintenance, and the pipes are breaking, and they need to spend a lot of money to correct these problems, but they're unwilling to do that because the mayor and others are pushing to demolish public housing. So this became an issue when community organizers raised it and got some politicians involved, and it's become a big issue in the city. I couldn't go to Creighton Court, where the situation is the most difficult, and say, I know you have no heat. I know your kids are cold. I know that you're probably catching, colds and bronchitis and so on. But I really want to talk to you about the situation in Yemen, which is so much.
Wow. Yeah.
Objectively, that's true, but that's not going to be a conversation we're going to have. Across the country, the average person in this country is carrying $8,000 worth of credit card debt, has maybe $1,000 in the bank, and no retirement plan other than Social Security. That's true. They are feeling very anxious, and whether they're progressive in their politics or reactionary, they have serious economic concerns. If you bring up a question of what the U.S. is doing in Syria, what it's doing in Libya today, the bombings in Somalia, the escalation of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and you can't connect that to people's day-to-day lives and working class concerns, you can forget about building any kind of a movement that's other than middle-class white people who have the luxury of being concerned about other people's problems. And that's where the peace movement has been for many, many years. There's always been a different current that has tried to say money for jobs, not for war, that has tried to explain what the cost of an aircraft carrier could be used for in a city in terms of new hospitals and clinics and education and jobs, as well as sensitize people to the suffering and the just struggles that are taking place in many countries, which was much easier before the emergence of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban. But the objective of oppression of people in these war-torn countries is something that can be explained. So the Defenders, as you know, has always pushed for bringing these two areas of struggle together, domestic issues and international issues. And we're in the fortunate position this past spring to be the lead organizers on the national conference held here in Richmond by the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. And the theme was Stop the Wars at Home and Abroad, which had been raised earlier in previous conferences, but it was put into more concrete forms at this conference, where the conference was actually half devoted to international issues and half devoted to domestic issues and drawing the connections between the two, and also had the strongest participation by Black leadership of any anti-war conference in recent or in memory, and we were very proud of that. We don't know where the anti-war movement is going at this point. There's going to be an important conference coming weekend, January 12th to 14th in Baltimore, sponsored by the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases. UNAC is involved, Veterans for Peace, U.S. Peace Council, World Beyond War, many of the larger anti-war organizations, and some kind of a proposal for a mobilization will come out of that conference, but we're unclear what form that will take. And if it will, in fact, try to address how militarism and war spending abroad contributes to the deterioration of the standard of living of working class people, particularly communities of color here at home. That's our perspective. There are other perspectives, and we're not sure which one will prevail. But we're going to be participating in the conference. I'm one of the scheduled speakers. We're going to have a strong presence from the Defenders, and try to argue that we can no longer tolerate a firewall between the struggle against U.S. wars abroad and the struggle against the wars here at home against the working class and oppressed communities.
That is some very clear. I'm getting a little feedback, and I don't know why. Let's see. Let me do that. So the connection between a domestic movement for justice and focusing on an international anti-war effort is so clear when you realize, like we say all the time, well, you say specifically, that the goal of this government is to keep Americans so overworked, so sick, so stressed out, and so tired and frustrated that we feel powerless to do anything about what they're doing to us, so that they can actually do much more around the world, that we're not even, we're so overwhelmed that we're not even concerned with it. And I think that's one of the issues that you just alluded to, Phil, that so many people are so overburdened with immediate everyday stuff that they have no idea how to solve. And they feel like they can't fight those issues that affect their everyday life, that, you know, they don't want to hear about the war in Yemen. That's the problem of those people over there. But it's the job of us activists who are interested in social and racial justice here, and also interested in ending American imperialism around the world, right, to make that connection to those people, but not just have a conversation, but to also stand in the gap, I guess.
You're beginning to break up a little bit.
Oh, am I breaking up? Okay, sorry about that. We're having some audio. Can you hear me? You cannot hear me now. Okay, you guys online, let us know.
I'm losing seriously.
Let us know if you can hear us online, everybody, because we're having some audio issues on this end. So let's see. Let me see what I can do here. Everything looks good on this end, Phil.
That's better now.
Okay, and we can hear you. Okay, good. All right, so it is critical that we in the social and racial justice movement here in America not only connects the importance of ending American imperialism around the world with those two issues, but also to help people get to whatever the next step is in their understanding, and teaching people how to fight. Because I think that's a huge issue with people who are faced with everyday problems. They have no idea what the next step is. You know, okay, fine, I can go to a protest, but what is that going to do? So I think we have to have some patience with people who are frustrated with their situation at home, and helping them understand how their everyday mobilization is important. It is effective, how we can empower people. And that's what we see the Virginia Defenders do so well. Getting people involved in local efforts that do affect their everyday lives. Mm-hmm. And then when they get involved in those efforts, then we broach the subject. Well, you and Anna Edwards broach the issues. Hey, this is how this connects to the war in Yemen. This is how what we're fighting against here connects to the war in Afghanistan. This is why you need to be interested in fighting American imperialism.
I don't believe peace activists can spend all their times on international issues and then go to working class communities of color, and say, you must get involved in what we're concerned about. The Defenders has always had a different perspective. We've always been involved in anti-war activities. We were a co-founder of the United National Anti-War Coalition. I'm a member of the group's national leadership body, the administrative committee. We played a leading role in trying to move the coalition further to the left, rewrote the statement of principles that has recently been adopted. You can see it on the UNAC website, unacpeace.org, unacpeace.org. But we are not unknown in the community here in Richmond. We are known for fighting to reclaim Shacklebottom, the area of the city that was the former major slave trading site in the country, domestic slave trade. We are one of the two organizations organizing the January 20th rally for prisoner rights here in Richmond that is attracting, it looks like it'll be well over 100 people, and that will be the largest rally in support of prisoner rights in many years in the state, and it's still growing. We are involved in supporting the Fight for 15 movement. We are supporting the community organizers who have exposed the condition in Creighton Court. They're going to have a protest here in Richmond on Monday outside the offices of the Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority. And at the same time, we're doing this interview here with your organization. I'm going to be writing a piece over the next few days about the Iran protests. We are involved. We coordinate UNAC's Odessa Solidarity Committee, which was formed as a support group for the relatives of anti-fascists who were murdered in Odessa, Ukraine, a few months after the 2014 right-wing coup. We traveled to Europe 4 times last year to attend conferences and participate in marches against NATO, and also to stand with the people of Odessa during their second anniversary memorial service, which was threatened by fascists with attacks with machine guns.
Wow.
And we carried out an international campaign that got the attention of the U.S. State Department that there would be Americans at that memorial. And we hope that had some effect in the U.S. convincing the Ukrainian government to convince the fascist organizations that support them to hold back on that day. What I'm saying is that we're involved from the grassroots community level to the regional level, to the national level, to the international level. And we think that that's the kind of approach that the anti-war movement needs to take. We actually don't feel there should be an anti-war movement separate from the environmental movement, the labor movement, the women movement, the LGBTQ movement. We have to be one movement. People can have different focuses. People can have different issues that they're most concerned about personally, but we can coordinate activities so this firewall between the international and domestic issues can come down. And one of the biggest reasons we have this problem is not only the issue of endless wars and 8 years of giving Obama a free hand on international issues, is the continued role of the Democratic Party, which is absolutely committed to maintaining the military to support the American empire around the world, to maximize the profits of the corporations and the bank. And all of these organizations that have sprung up since the Trump administration to support the Democratic Party, you will never see them raise the issue of the wars. You will never see them calling on the government to get out of Afghanistan, get out of Iraq, get out of Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, to withdraw their military forces that are now in almost every country in Africa, to stop the sanctions and attacks against Venezuela, to stop threatening North Korea. You will not find that at all. And so as we move into 2018, and the thoughts of most progressive activists in the country is focused on how can we get rid of Trump? And they want to do that by the 2018 congressional elections and return the House and the Senate to the Democrats and provide a break on this crazy man who is devastating all the gains that we've made through years of struggle in labor, environmental issues, women's issues, LGBTQ, on and on and on. But they're being swept up back into the Democratic Party as the major vehicle for fighting Trump. And if they raise the wars at all, it's Trump wars. Trump doing this and Trump doing that and Trump doing the other. Trump didn't destroy Libya. Barack Obama destroyed
Right.
Libya.
That's right.
Cheered on, goaded on by Hillary Clinton. So we've got to, on a local level, we might want to support candidates regardless of what political affiliation they are. But once you get up to the national level in Congress, every politician supports imperialism. They have to, or they don't get funded. Look what happened to Cynthia McKinney. They get rid of them.
Yep.
With very few exceptions. Bernie Sanders had to be dragged kicking and screaming into speaking out against racism and police brutality. But he while he was a candidate, he never spoke out against the wars. You see? And this is our problem. People say, well, look, we got to stop Trump because of this and this and this and this and this and this and this. So, okay, so go over to Palestine and explain to the people of Gaza why you're going to support a candidate that will support the next Israeli bombardment of their neighborhood and kill their children because he's better on some domestic issues or she's better on some domestic issues. We need a broad-based, multi-militant, independent, anti-racist, anti-sexist movement that identifies the Democratic Party as the twin party of and goes down to the core of the issues, which is that we have a society based on putting people over profits. And until we turn that paradigm upside down, we are never going to stop wars, racism, the oppression of working class people, destruction of the environment, or any other issue we're concerned about.
So Phil, now that we come to the end, please give to our audience how can they contact you? How can they get involved?
If you are in Virginia, or now, because of our cooperation, Washington, D.C., you can check us out on our website, which is Defenders. The group is called the Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. And our website is defendersfje.blogspot.com. defendersfje.blogspot.com. Or you can write us at defendersfje@hotmail.com. I think we're the last group in the country that uses Hotmail. Defendersfje at hotmail.com.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Phil. You said Hotmail. Well, I can truly say that this has been a very, very informative hour that we had. And just to let the audience know, Jacqueline and I are part of the Defenders. So
yes, we are.
We've been in the trenches with Phil and Anna and the rest of the guys a few times. We have some of you may have seen some of the videos we posted, but as Phil said, I mean, this is something that we have to really get involved in. And Phil, briefly, could you remind us again upcoming events? I know we have the one in Baltimore.
Yeah.
For those who might have joined us a little late.
This coming weekend, January 12th, 13th, and 14th, we'll be in Baltimore at the University of Maryland for the conference sponsored by the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases. UNAC will have a strong presence there, United National Anti-War Coalition, which the Defenders is a founding member. We're going to have 7 of our members there. We will be promoting crafting a spring or summer mobilization that unites the issues as we've been talking about. The following weekend, Saturday, January 20th, for anyone in Virginia, we strongly urge you to come out Saturday, January 20th from 2 to 3 p.m. for a rally for prison reform at the state capitol grounds in downtown Richmond, the corner of 9th and Bank Streets. 2 to 3 p.m. Saturday, January 20th at the state capitol grounds in downtown Richmond, 9th and Bank Street. We are one of the organizations that is putting together this rally at the initiative of a prisoner organization called Virginia Prisoner of Conscience. These are prisoners who have been educating themselves on issues, are promoting support for half a dozen bills that will come up in the General Assembly, and who see the need to build the kind of a movement that we've been talking about. The Coalition for Justice in Blacksburg, Virginia, is taking the lead on the organizing, supported by the defenders, and there are now more than a dozen other co-sponsors. There's a Facebook page. If you look up Virginia Rally for Prison Reform, Virginia Rally for Prison Reform, you'll find the Facebook page with information about that. We'd love to have you come out and support that action. It'll mean a great deal to the brothers and sisters behind bars, and will morph into a lobbying campaign around these particular bills for truth in sentencing, bringing back parole, which was abolished in Virginia, several other things that, while not revolutionary solutions to mass incarceration, would make life significantly better and create an atmosphere that's easier for people to struggle behind the walls. And we want to provide that support for our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated.
Well, you got it, folks out there in Luqman Nation. Thank you, Phil, for spending a wonderful
I don't hear you.
with us. And Jacquie?
So, Phil and Anna Edwards, who is not on tonight, will be regular guests on Coffee,
right.
Current Events, and Politics in Luqman Nation. Once a month, we are going to have a conversation about the work that the Virginia Defenders are doing, not just in Richmond, but the work that we are going to be doing with them together. Because this is what we created Coffee, Current Events, and Politics in Luqman Nation to do, to focus on the work on the ground that people are doing to improve their communities and to improve this country and the lives of people in it, and affect better outcomes for people around the world. So stay tuned for more conversations with our friends Phil and Anna.
Oh, it's my.
Uh-oh. Did we lose you? Oh, there you are. You're still there.
Still there.
Yes.
Okay.
We cut you off.
Well, I was just going to mention that I spoke with Reverend Rodney Hunter today at Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church in Richmond, and he very enthusiastically agreed to let us use the church for 6 consecutive months for a monthly forum on international issues. We want to address the current, the recent events in Zimbabwe, the expansion of the U.S. military across Africa, the humanitarian and military crisis in Yemen, the expansion of NATO eastward towards Russia, what is really behind the crisis between the U.S. and North Korea, and the crisis in Venezuela, as the initial 6 topics. And this we're talking about starting in March. And y'all and I had a conversation earlier today about repeating the programs in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
So we're going to be in discussion about that. And this is an important thing for the defenders to be doing, because there's very little of this educational work being done on, particularly to working class audiences and the communities of color. And we think we can make a contribution in that way. And the fact that y'all are members of the Defenders and want to promote this in D.C. puts us, light years ahead in moving forward in this. So,
well, as Jacquie said, Phil, and to the rest of you out there, I mean, look, it's plenty of work to be done.
Yeah.
And so we're all on the front lines of this. So thank you, Phil, once again.
Thank you
to
so much.
Anna. Thank you for those of you who have joined us today.
We see you back there, Anna.
And once again, like Jacquie said, Phil and Anna Edwards will be regular contributors to Coffee, Current Events, and Politics. Ah, there she is.
There she is.
Yep. And